This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to Novak's webinar series. This is a project we started a little over a year ago, and we've had a dozen or so, and we feel like they've been pretty successful, and we've had some great presenters come on and give it a lot of knowledge, particularly about off-highway vehicle-related issues and tools and ways forward. So we hope to continue the series, and we think we've got a great one for you tonight. When I look through everybody who's participating, a lot of familiar names and faces, and some new ones as well. And we've had a lot of success recently in working with American Trails and partnering with them on some webinars. And we really think it speaks to the general feeling that we're all having that the disparate recreation modes are finding it easier to work with one another and recognizing that when we work together, a rising tide lifts all boats. But having said that, the information you're going to hear from Scott tonight will apply to economic studies from just about any kind of recreational use, but you may hear a little bit of, OHV centric talk about some of the studies and some of the ways we do things. But nevertheless, the ultimate goal here is to recognize that good data is good for everybody. And if we make sure we have economic impact studies that are grounded in truth and reality, it's going to make it easier for all of us, irrespective of our of the way we access trails and the outdoors, have a better say and have a better time and a better ability to fully convey the message the industry brings to the table in terms of economic impact. So with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter. His name is Scott Jones. He's an attorney. He also happens to be on the board of directors for NOVAC, the National Off-Highway Vehicle Conservation Council. He's a personal friend, and he's been great for our organization. He's been great for off-highway vehicle recreation, and I think he's going to do a great job tonight. So we're just delighted that Scott's willing to come and talk about analyzing economic impact studies. And without further ado, I will turn it over to him. Scott?
Thank you,
Oh,
Dwayne.
wait, sorry, Scott. I do want to mention a bit of bookkeeping. Up on the top right of your screen should be a chat button. And if you click on that button, it'll open a chat feature. If you have questions at any point during Scott's presentation, feel free to type them in. It's unlikely we'll interrupt him during his presentation, but at the end, we'll make sure that all the questions get asked and answered. And please remember to stay on mute. Sorry for the fire drill there, Scott. With that, I will turn it over to you.
It was easy. It wouldn't be fun, right?
That's right.
So first off, I just want to say thanks to Christopher and Federal Highways and American Trails and everybody that's really kind of come together to really start driving these webinars. I think they're hugely valuable, and thank you for that partnership. A little bit about myself. I am an attorney. So you're going to ask, why is the attorney talking about economics? I've been involved with the Cove Coast studies here in Colorado for quite a few years now. And actually, before I went to law school, that was my undergrad background, was economics. So kind of something I've done on and off all my life. And I'm certainly not going to attempt to make you guys the, experts on economic, preparing an economic contribution study or anything to that effect. But, this is something that I think we've run into is, for me, what really drove that, I think, the need to start discussing this issue is I was at a meeting someplace and laying in the hotel room. We've all certainly done that. Scrolling through the channels, and ESPN is one of the channels, and I'm like, wow, what's a national cornhole championship? Where they're throwing the bean bags through the holes in the plywood. And, I'm like, well, ESPN's hit a new low. And I didn't realize there was even a national organization for a cornhole championship. So I Google searched it quick, and I'm like, the first thing that popped up was, cornhole recreation, it contributes hundreds of millions of dollars to the U.S. economy. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's going to make me raise an eyebrow. So, that's really what kind of started these discussions. For me, Laura, next slide, please. But I think this is something we can all relate to, regardless of what our recreational activity is. Friday you get paid, you're going out for the weekend, you got some cash in your pocket, that kind of thing. Whatever your chosen recreation is, you're heading to the mountains, you're going to the lake, you're doing whatever. Laura, next slide. So Sunday afternoon, this is how it ends up for the motorized community. Things don't go quite as expected, but I think this is something that everybody can relate to. You know, you're out in the boat and, oh, your buddy's got that new 6-bearing Shimano reel and it casts 10 feet further, or, you know, you're out snowshoeing and your buddy's snowshoes aren't post holing in as bad as yours, or your pack leaks or your tent leaks or whatever. You know, by Sunday afternoon, you probably come back with a need for something that needs to be purchased or resolved or fixed or whatever. So that kind of brings us to a big discussion, Laura, next tile, about economics and what does, when all of us do kind of the same things conceptually over these weekends, what does this net out to? And I think the discussion here is not so much, an economic contribution study versus an economic impact study versus an economic valuation. I think really what we're trying to do is, as Dwayne mentioned, really kind of make people aware that good data can be a huge resource for you, and bad data can really have some bad long-term implications. It can really set some expectations in terms of discussions with partners that you're never going to achieve. And that can really, negatively impact not only the partnership, but also maybe how you're planning a project, how you're allocating very limited resources or that kind of stuff. And, when Covco started doing their study back in the late 80s, I want to say, early 90s, it was kind of, an unusual study. Now, there's so many economic contribution studies out there that, it's like from drinking from a fire hydrant. You Google search, economic contribution of this, that, or the other thing, you'll have all kinds of studies. And, what we're going to really try and do is give you guys some benchmarks to do some comparison for, and then kind of give you some criteria to look at to, really go, okay, is this study good, bad, other, that kind of stuff. So, Laura, next tile. So what we really wanted to start with was kind of what are the benchmarks that are out there for good economic information at the landscape level, and really the Department of Commerce BEA research for recreation that's been coming out the last couple of years is really phenomenal. But the Forest Service, BLM, and other land managers, even state and some of the local studies I've seen have been very impressive. Those can be some very good, pieces of information for discussion. And then kind of delve down into some of the user group or issue specific studies, and understand why you'd be there, and then some of the challenges that you might see for economic information moving forward. So next tile, please. So first off, for this group, this is kind of a silly start, but we give this discussion quite a bit. We want to talk about, who is the Department of Commerce? They're the folks federally that calculate inflation. They do the census. They calculate retail sales, gross domestic product, per capita income. That's all they do. They live and breathe economics at the national level. They're pretty credible, and consistency, I think, with those folks is something that you should always be looking to. Next tile, please, Laura. All right, so under Secretary Jewell and President Obama, there was a request that the Department of Commerce, through the Bureau of Economic Analysis, start looking at outdoor recreation economic contributions. They did that. Here is the rough numbers. This is the 2016 numbers. They haven't changed a whole lot to 2017, but $412 billion is not a small number, and it's a significant. It's about 2.2% of the whole U.S. economy, and in many communities, it's a significantly larger number. In terms of what people are spending, I will tell you to go to the Department of Commerce's website. They've got some really great graphics for people that are going to be doing, discussions around economic benefits from outdoor recreation. And they do break down at the national level to some user groups. So, and they do highlight the 38 billion from boating, 19 billion from OHV, 10 billion from snow, and that kind of stuff. So they do some breakdowns of user groups and activities, and they have just volumes of data at this point. But next tile. They also provide some breakdowns of their number based on user segments or categories of usage. And they do provide the motorized is pretty significant. Boating and fishing is also, there's no small numbers here. It's only 10 billion. Oh, okay. Well, if we're to that level, that seems a little a little anticlimactic to say the least. But they like I said, they give you some really good information. And the motorized component really kind of, when you combine motorized vehicles and boating and fishing, which is predominantly boats, really overwhelmingly, it attributes for that kind of a spending. So they do provide quite a bit of good information. And that's one thing we've always worked for is who's spending what and that kind of stuff, because when you're going in and proposing a trail development for a community or something like that, that's one of the first things we always hear here in Colorado is, well, who are we targeting and why? So that's good information. They did notice. Next slide, Laura. They did identify motorcycle and ATV, at 20.3 billion. It's one of the fastest growing segments of the recreational economy, which is always something that resonates quite well with, the local community that may be transitioning from, losing their mine, or the timber industry that, is moving on or changing or evolving or something like that. So this is a really good source of very credible information that we just wanted to quickly highlight. And make people aware of. Next tile, Laura. All right, so it's really good information for folks to have, but the problem is, those numbers are national numbers, and it can be very difficult for the folks at the county level, or the local municipality, or even a forest or a regional economic development plan to be able to relate to those numbers. It's difficult to go into Grand Junction, Colorado, and go, hey, we want to build some trail, and that's, well, 412 is great, but what's that mean for the local community? How many jobs, how much tax revenue, that kind of stuff. But it is difficult to relate for a local project. But on the good end of this, the Department of Commerce has provided state level reports for every state in the country. Laura, are we next tile? Next one. Perfect. All right. And those are Google searchable. That's the link to the Department of Commerce's website up there. And they have a lot of data on each one of the states that is certainly super valuable if you don't have an economic contribution study or an economic analysis of some form for your state or area. This is a great starting point for folks to just get some resources to go in and talk about trails. But this is also a pretty good margin or comparison tool if you've got another study that may be from a state group, or maybe on an event specific nature or something like that. But that's where that is. Every state has one. They break it down quite well, but it's an Excel spreadsheet, not particularly compelling for discussion. But I wanted to make sure people understood that that resource is out there. Moving on to other resources that are out there, probably a little more local level, would be federally, Forest Service and BLM both have very good data that they've been developing over the last several years. What this data provides for a lot of folks that the BEA has but can be difficult to find is this does provide on a forest by forest level rough estimates of, how many visits people are seeing, what are people spending in terms of recreation, where are they coming from, where are they not coming from. But each one of these forests has this type of information available now. If you just search, here's Pike San Isabel. Let's just search Pike San Isabel economics at a glance. It'll come right up, and it's a pretty good resource because, like I said, it does provide quite a bit of different information than the BEA information, but it's also fairly local. So if you're going in to talk to a ranger district about a trailless situation, or you're talking to a local community, this is far more localized, and it does provide great information. This is one page I want to say most of these reports are about 12 to 15 pages in length. And, there's a lot of information in terms of tax revenues, PILT revenue, jobs, that kind of stuff. So it's another source of information, that does compare recreation to, as you can see, timber and grazing and energy and that kind of stuff. So again, a very good resource that, at one point the Forest Service and BLM didn't have the world's best information. They've really done a good job over the last several years in developing some pretty detailed information on what's going on in these forests in terms of economic contributions from various activities. Next tile, Laura. The next, again, like I said, BLM, they present theirs a little differently, but again, it's a good source of information. If you wanted to talk about, state to state, this state has a great OHV program and this one doesn't, here's what you could see in terms of benefits. But again, this is another good comparison tool across, energy and grazing and timber and that kind of stuff. Again, pretty credible information that's really been made available for folks to, rely on going forward. So next tile, Laura. And then we kind of drive down to the most localized information generally. These are user group studies or more localized studies, probably would be the best way to look at it. These can be very, very issue or event specific, and really take and drive national data down to a level that you can go in and talk to your city council or whomever about an event or whatever, that kind of stuff. I mean, here we have a couple of examples of the Hatfield-McCoy Trail System in West Virginia and the Paiute Trail in Utah. These are pretty specific trail networks and that have developed a lot of information and detailed research for folks to be relying on. And this opens, I think, a little bit different discussion and a little bit of concern on, good data can be great, bad data can not be so great. So that's really what I wanted to kind of start talking about, with folks is that, how do you decide what's good data, what's not good data, and how do you, some tools to be looking at that, because, I don't want to be going into a local community and, going back to my national cornhole championship thing, this is going to generate $100 million. And, the city gives tax incentives. The event comes and really not much happens. That's not good for any of us, regardless of what your recreational pursuit is. So next tile, please. Next tile, Laura.
Scott, she advanced it.
Oh, okay. All right, there we go. All right, perfect. Thanks. Sorry. So some of the stuff, that we can be looking at to make sure we have good data being, identified and brought forward, and maybe you're not relying on data that's not so great. Are there partners to the study? Is the local college involved? Is the state involved? Here in Colorado, we've had a lot of success in working with both the Forest Service and BLM here in Colorado. Luckily, we got economists in both of those offices. and they've worked with us on our studies here for a long time. Great information, but also a great fact check. Is it consistent with other conclusions from Department of Commerce, Forest Service, BLM, that kind of stuff? Are the categories that they're trying to understand or analyze, are they reasonably consistent? And we'll get into that in a little while. And that's something I think we stumble over quite a bit sometimes, is in our zeal to get a big number. Sometimes we tend to pull in things in the study process that may not be directly related to the activity we're trying to analyze. But I'd also, encourage people to, just ask themselves, does this make sense? Do these conclusions, just kind of pass the, I don't know about that one. But I think something else that can definitely be a factor to be looked at, in determining is this a good study, is this not so great a study, would be, how much supporting data do they have? I know in our study here in Colorado, we have a short one that's about 10 pages. And then we also have a 55 or 60 page study where we break it down every which way. How many people did we analyze in the study? How many people returned the questionnaire? How many people got the questionnaire? What was their response in terms of, how many miles did they go? That kind of stuff. Did they go overnight? Did they spend the day? What were they doing? How much did they spend? That kind of information can also add a lot of credibility to a study and supporting the numbers that are being reached on that study. So just a couple of quick factors, in a piece of research. Next tile. As I mentioned, state or even a college or that kind of stuff can really add a lot of credibility. Good example of this is the study that New York State Snowmobile did on snowmobile recreation in the state of New York. Again, just they partnered with, I think it was SUNY Potsdam when they did their study, and it can help a lot because really once you start getting into it, we've had a lot of folks that wanted to do their own studies, and once you start getting into a state level study, there's a lot of things that you got to look at, and those folks can be a huge resource for you. Next tile, please. Back one, Laura. I think it's back. Yeah, one. Yep. Okay. And this could be something that's a combination of a lot of small factors too. And I'd use our most recent Colorado study here as an example of something that's got a lot of factors in combination with each other that can really kind of make you go, okay, this is probably reasonably consistent. It is, number one, it does, reasonably consistent with the national BEA, Department of Commerce conclusions for the state. We prepared it in partnership with the federal and state land managers. That we did bring in a third-party economist to prepare the study that does economic analysis every day of the week. She's forgotten more about economics than I'm ever going to know. And there's a lot of really detailed information provided in the complete study as to how many miles people were going, what was their sport they were pursuing, how many people were in their group. All of that kind of stuff really can add quite a bit of information to or credibility to any of the studies and that you may see out there. And it's driving those national conclusions to a more local and relatable level, which I think is an important component of why you would undertake a study like that for a specific group of folks in a specific state or a specific event or that kind of stuff. So next tile, Laura. And this is just an example of something that you wouldn't, to look at the study, you would go, okay, this seems pretty reasonable, but just kind of fact check it for yourself. And this is a congressional level study that was done in the 2nd District here in Colorado, which on its face doesn't cause a lot of eyebrows to come up. But when you realize that pretty much every global destination for skiing in Colorado, like Aspen, Snowmass, Vail, Breckenridge, A Basin, all of the major ski areas are in that congressional district, and they didn't make the list. That should cause some concern. And that's one of those things that, it's difficult to point to a single factor that might be causing that. But here in Colorado, yeah, skiing is kind of king, and we're a global destination. But there shouldn't be any replacement for that local knowledge and local expertise on what's going on in the district. Another example of probably a little larger need to fact check would be that National Cornhole Championship and the sport contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to the economy. It's probably not something you want to get involved with. And next tile. So right now I wanted to talk really kind of quickly, because this is something that is an issue we run into, I think, quite a bit in these studies, is the user group or general categories of purchases. For those that aren't aware, there's this economic model out there. There's actually 2 or 3, I think, but one is kind of really kind of become the gold standard in terms of economic analysis for recreation, and that's the IMPLAN model, which is a third-party consulting company that's really, it is an amazing amount of money or amount of resource in terms of how much they're spending, how much data they're managing at this point. But what they do is they break it down, and I'm going to apologize, at the bottom of that tile appears to have gotten cut off, but that's just the same tile from the Department of Commerce, just kind of breaking things into general categories. And what IMPLAN does is take all those categories and break them down into how much did you spend on this, how much did you spend on that, and then how does all those categories relate to a specific activity or a specific area or something like that, in terms of how many jobs did it create, how much tax revenue does that purchase create, are you using it for multiple things, that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, this is kind of something that if they're using IMPLAN data, that's got quite a bit of credibility as well. It's also important to note that IMPLAN, as a process, also provides a service. They can cut and analyze data. You can send them a draft of your study, and they will review it for you, that kind of stuff. And from that perspective, they can do as much or as little as you want. But I think, as you can imagine, IMPLAN doing your research is not cheap. And that's where I think some people run into some issues. Is it's expensive to get the data, and they try and work around the IMPLAN discussions and research, and kind of try and go out on their own, and they sometimes run into problems. So next tile. Why these general categories matter. I mean, and from their examples, a boat. Okay, there's not much outside of boating that you're going to do with a boat. I mean, you're not going to go out and plow a field with it. You're not going to, mountain climb with a boat or anything like that. Same thing with firearms. There's a pretty limited number of things that you're going to do with a firearm. Hunt, yep. Target shoot, yep. Going spelunking, probably not. Are you going to, do other things? There's a pretty limited number of things that you're going to do with something like that, and they fit into those categories pretty neatly. There's not a ton of overlap in other categories for a lot of those, for some of these items, that's for sure. And then next tile, Laura. So there's definitely those neat, clean categories, but then you get into these other types of equipment I think we all own, that may fit a category or a type of usage, but they're not going to get too far out of that usage. For those that aren't aware, that's an avalanche backpack. The theory being that you wear this backpack when you're out snowmobiling, skiing, hybrid skiing, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, and if you should be unlucky to get into a situation where there's an avalanche, you pull the cord, the big airbag kicks up, and you float down through the avalanche. There's a limited number of uses for that piece of equipment. It's expensive, it's great, but as I note there, they're not particularly light. So the odds on you going hiking in the summertime with that thing are pretty much zero. And don't get near a plane with them because the TSA hates them. So these are going to be pretty much winter recreational usage driven. And I think we can all come up with things like that where we're, it's got a narrower usage. You're not going to be, using your shorts in the wintertime, that kind of stuff, vice versa. The giant down parka, not going to be using that in summertime. But there could be a lot of these types of pieces of equipment that you would be buying that you would be looking to calculate into an economic contribution study, where there is a valid need to take and cross some of those categories that I mentioned before. And that's what InPlan tries to do in their process, is to deal with some of those pieces of equipment that, and you can kind of see some of this. Next tile, Laura. But then there's other categories of purchases that fit in everything under the sun. Real estate would be one, motor vehicles, all kinds of stuff that you buy for about 805 different reasons, and you use for everything. I mean, if you got my pickup truck sitting in the driveway, yeah, I'm going to use it to go snowmobiling. I'm going to use it to work on my cabin. I'm going to, tow my ATV with it. I, use it to carry my deer when I go hunting, that kind of stuff. I mean, real estate purchases are another thing that people want to use because there's a lot of value there in terms of spending. But it's tough to go, okay, this piece of property was purchased for one reason only, or trying to allocate, hey, I purchased a second home and I bought it for hunting, or I bought it for hunting and hiking, or I bought it for, I just wanted to get away from my annoying neighbors. Those types of really diverse reasons to buy a piece of property can be very difficult to bring into a study with any levels of accuracy. But, this is also where a small variation in your analysis can add, significant amounts of value to your study as you're moving forward. And this is something that does happen quite a bit. Next style, Laura. And this is an example of, an effort to reallocate from the InPlan categories to try and come up with a more specific, study group. And it, they did disclose it. So kudos. I'm not going to mention who did the study, but it does happen. And this is something that you can really get yourself into some trouble with. But you can also, it's not terrible if your data and you've got enough, you say you've sampled, I don't know, 50% of a category users, and they're all going the same answer. Then you can go, okay, maybe there's something going on here. Maybe this is a little more accurate than the economic modeling folks are saying. But this is where the detailed information in the study can be very, very helpful. Going back to those examples of how many people did you talk to, how many people return or attempt to talk to, how many people actually returned your study, how did you determine your study group, was it peer reviewed either by the InPlan folks or a school or something else, and the people even get down to the level of what were your questions, how did you frame your questions, that kind of stuff. That's where that kind of data can be very, very helpful and may be able to justify something that is a little inconsistent, or it doesn't particularly align with the national studies, that kind of thing. And this is also where you can add credibility to those national conclusions and drive to a more localized piece of information, by giving that supporting information. But again, it's a particularly conceptual issue, but it does happen. And I think this is where we start getting into some of the problematic conclusions, where people are off trying to do it on their own, or a group is maybe got really passionate about their topic and they don't understand it. You may buy your pickup truck or a piece of property or whatever, for a lot of different reasons, and you do have to reflect that in a study. So next tile, Laura. And this is something even the federal government has kind of run into. This is a study from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing, from 2011. This was kind of a groundbreaking study at its time. But one of the major criticisms of this was, we're trying to drive purchases to a single interest or concern. And in this study, and this is, I think, something that you should be aware of too, is when the other category is a huge portion of your study, that may be an indicator something's not quite right. But in this study, they included in the other category land purchases, vehicles, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know anybody that I have ever run into that can tell me they bought a piece of equipment or a piece of real estate for a single usage. Are they out there? Yeah, absolutely. And that usage may be running a business. But when you get into the recreational activities, like personally, I just purchased a piece of property about 4 years ago, and there was a lot of factors I looked into. As I bought it, was it a good price? Did I think I could make money on it? What's my neighborhood like? And those kind of tangible things may not be related at all to my recreational pursuits that I want to pursue on the property. Did I look at, can I hunt on this property? Yeah, I absolutely did. Can I ride an OHV? Absolutely. Is it close to the local trailhead? Yeah, absolutely. I looked at it. But it also abuts a state wildlife area that's totally landlocked, and I'm never going to have neighbors. Those are the kind of things that can really influence these kinds of purchases, that make it difficult to allocate all of that spending to one group. So again, just kind of something as a discussion point for, just be careful when you start looking at these studies and that kind of stuff. Laura, next tile. They can be huge resources for you. If you can come in and go, building trails here or holding an event or, whatever it is can generate, $1 million in income, $100,000 in tax revenue, and it's going to account for, 1,000 jobs in a local community that's moving away from, their traditional extractive drivers like, mining or something like that. That can be a huge tool for the recreational community. But you got to be a little careful because it can be gold or, next tile, Laura. Bad data hurts us all. And that can be something that can be very, very difficult to, resolve once a decision has been made at a local level or even a state level. People are expecting to see, thousands of visitors, and all this tax revenue, and this is going to sort out the school issues and that kind of stuff, and then it doesn't happen. That's going to be a problem for not just the people who are pushing that study or using that study, but I think that's going to be a credibility problem in terms of, that community or that user or that forest moving forward, because there are other people that can be using land, that you've gone in and said, hey, we can do the trails for this kind of stuff, and they could be using it for other usages like farming, grazing, that kind of stuff. So good data can be great. It can be that nugget of gold that you're looking for, but bad data can be really bad too. And I think we need to be really cognizant of that. So I think with that, that's what, 45 minutes already. Questions?
Thanks, Scott. Dwayne here again. Thank you for the presentation, and I particularly like the last slide because I think so many of us can get caught up in finding the biggest possible number, and we get attracted to that and want to be able to go in and tell decision makers, hey, this is the huge amount of money our particular interest is going to bring. And what we end up doing is chasing each other. So, in the motorized community, we get the biggest number we can. Then another non-motorized use might get the biggest number they can. And then somebody comes in like cornhole, who we hadn't even considered it up to this point, and they get the biggest number they can. Where instead, if we're all providing accurate information to get what we want, I think we'll paint a better holistic picture of what recreation generally can provide and make it easier for decision makers to decide in favor of recreation. It isn't just that we need to have a big number, it's that we need to have a good number. It's that the result from the outcomes have to match the data we put in pretty closely. So I really appreciate you raising that topic. And there's over the last 10 years or so, there's been such a push to focus on economic impact for all of our recreational activities, that we don't need it to be a race. What we need instead is to work together and make sure we're really targeting what the actual income impact and whole economic picture looks like, because I think that's going to make it easier for all of us. So I really appreciate
I totally
that. Yeah. So we do have some questions. I'll start from the top. We have a question from Jennifer, and that's what makes the federal data credible?
I think from the Department of Commerce perspective, it is the fact that it's the Department of Commerce, and they calculate the gross domestic product, personal taxes, per capita income, all of that kind of stuff, and they've got, decades and decades and decades of research. They're looking at it's a big body of research that's just out there, and realistically, it's hopefully, let's put it this way, hopefully, not tainted by a personal agenda. It's been through some sort of a peer review process, a vetting process, that kind of stuff. Is definitely factors I would be looking at to say, this is pretty credible data.
Yeah, and I would add and hope you agree that also what makes it credible is that people will depend on it, particularly decision makers. They're used to looking at data from the federal government, and getting more data from the federal government is going to be like a warm blanket to them, and they're going to give it credibility that others may not. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's where I think the alignment with federal data of other resources, I think is a major indication that this is a pretty credible body of research that should be used for decision-making purposes. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Next, we have a comment from the Quiet Warrior, our friend Don Amador, Novak partner, shout out. And he says that data and study narrative have to make sense and match. And I think, you covered that a little bit, but would you like to expound?
Yeah, no, and I totally agree that the data needs to match what you're talking about. I think that second congressional district study, is probably a good example of where things didn't really align. Going back to that need for the questions you ask people, that type of an aspect of this is important too. I think we've all participated in those kind of studies when you're walking through the airport, and somebody comes up and goes, "Do you support this or do you support that?" And then it's like, what are you really asking me? They're asking, "Do you like clean air or something?" It's like, okay, well, yeah, but what's that mean? Why are you asking me that? Those kinds of things are major components of any credible piece of research that, you didn't ask a leading question. You didn't lead people to a single conclusion, or you said, you made, not only not asking leading questions, but also asking questions that can trigger thoughts from people that are going, hey, what did you spend on that weekend? Driving there, food, lodging, breakdowns. What did those kinds of, making people stop and think, oh yeah, I did, do this or that, or we, went out to eat every night, or we only, we brought our own food with us, or that kind of stuff. Those kinds of, factors should definitely be looked at as well. So, I mean, I think, alignment of what you're trying to study with the questions you're asking and the information you're obtaining is definitely a huge component of any credible piece of work.
Great, thank you. We have a comment from Chris, and he's talking about Forest Service motor vehicle use maps, and he's basically saying that the Forest Service breaks motorized into numerous categories. So they have maybe one category for fishing, but they have several for motorized, like snowmobiling, driving for pleasure, off-road. And he's saying that he feels like that may underreport the actual impact of motorized, or at least as it's compared to other categories. Do you have a comment on that?
I wouldn't say it underreports it. I'm familiar with the charts he's talking about from the National Visitor Use Data studies, and I've never looked at it as underreporting it. I see that as an opportunity to combine that. If you're talking about motorized access in general, okay, I wouldn't hesitate to go, okay, we're going to add up OHV, snowmobile, and road usage of, whatever. Which you can do with those studies, but it also gives you the opportunity to, if you're interested in developing a single track trail, or you're going, hey, we need to build a snowmobile parking lot, it does allow you to kind of cut and drive that data a little more locally, which I think is something that should be certainly looked at, in terms of, policy and project specific information. It is one of those usages that some of that stuff, you do have to look at and go, okay, if you're going to go back to those silos, I think it's an important point to make is the information can be aggregated back upward too. If there's a lot of detail in a study that, if you're talking about motorized access to a forest, yeah, you can combine snowmobiles and that kind of stuff with, motorcycles and driving for pleasure and that kind of stuff, because it's all the same basic recreational opportunity people are looking for. So
All right,
that's
thanks,
my thought on that.
Yeah, and I would just note that Don commented that he's seen similar categorizations, and he makes a good point, whether it's about this or any of the other topics you've covered, and that's if the user groups that's presenting the information doesn't understand what it means, how can we expect the elected officials or decision makers that we're presenting it to understand what it means? So I just think that's a great point to draw out.
I would agree.
Yeah. Next question from Richard is, how do we as a club who cares for trails on a U.S. national forest use these studies to help find more funding for trail work?
Boy, when you answer that question, let me know. I think the use for those studies is not particularly with the Forest Service, but I think you can definitely use these types of resources when you're talking about partnering. We do a lot of this kind of stuff out here where, you may have a great trail network on the forest, but the parking lot is terrible. And you may go approach the county and go, hey, we got these great trails, but we don't have a parking lot. Could you guys come in and when you pave the road, put the millings from the paver, in here, we'll grade them out and this and that. I think that type of a usage can definitely bring a lot of resources to the discussion. I don't see there being a huge number of monies available to the Forest Service, at the forest or even the ranger district level to, just go in and go, hey, we spend 3 times as much, so we should be entitled to that type of, a different allocation of resources. I don't think that would be the best way to use it, but you can certainly, use it to build partnerships with the local community, the county, the town, maybe even a local motorcycle dealership or whatever. If you're building a boat ramp, the local boat dealer, that kind of stuff. I think we have had success in using those types of studies and resources to drive the partner money to the discussions. So I think that's probably the most appropriate way to use those types of studies to really obtain resources. And in that discussion, I wouldn't hesitate to go, hey, my club's got 300 people, we'll come out and volunteer, and we can come up with $10,000 from the county or whatever. That's a great way to leverage a lot of different resources there. So
Yeah, awesome, and I agree totally. Would also say that the Forest Service and some of the other federal land management agencies have put a focus themselves on recreation in recent years, as they've moved away from extractive industries and looking for ways to serve the public. So maybe draw up a point that, the individual forest that you're working on could be absolutely in sync with what the headquarters is saying by adding recreation. And you're just providing this information to show that when recreation is added in forest at a forest level, it does provide economic impact. Okay, next question, or it's a comment. Ernest says, I like the way you started with creating partnerships to create data and approach land managers as unified advocates. Um, yeah, I certainly appreciate that as well. And I know Scott's committed to it. And to the extent we're working together, we're going to do better in the end. Now, the last question, Scott, I'm going to do something a little off course here. It's from Mark Emmerman, who's a longtime friend of Novak, and he himself performs economic impact studies. And Mark, if you want to quickly make your point and introduce who you are, I'd appreciate it if you wanted to just unmute yourself and maybe take a minute or two to make the point that you wanted to make.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. As I listened to all of this, one of the hardest things if you're an economic analyst like me is to be asked or approached for a bid or to tell what it would cost to update a study, and you look at the old study and it's just been magnified out of proportion because no organization wants to have a smaller number than last time. But you can't really be asked to perpetuate errors that were made in the past. So if you have an organization, any of you have an organization, you go looking for a new economic impact study, listen to the people you're talking to, the economists, and be a little skeptical if the numbers grow way out of proportion, and be a little understanding if they tell you that there were things that were done before that shouldn't be done again. I worked with an economist at Iowa State University for years by the name of Peter Erasm, and he always said that you should be much more careful if you get results that are way out of this world on your side than you should be if you get results that are disappointing, because you may have made those results happen with your assumptions. So that's kind of what I was getting at.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And Mark, if you want to quickly mention your company, and we know you've done some great things in the OHV world, and people are looking for economists. You might be a good place to start.
Well, I have a small company called Regional Strategic Limited. It's in Des Moines, Iowa at www.regionalstrategic.com. I've done work for a lot of organizations in recreation and also in natural resources and industry. I was at Iowa State University for about 25 years before I decided to do this on my own. And I do appreciate all of the requests I've gotten from the off-highway vehicle folks and being able to present at last year's conference. And I think it was about a year ago I did a webinar here.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It was a great one. So we're getting close to time here. So I would just ask Scott if you had a quick wrap up you wanted to do, and then we'll move to close.
I think the only wrap up I would have is number one, thanks for everybody for spending an hour of their evening with us. I think this is an important discussion that we're running into more and more. And I would, thanks again to American Trails and Federal Highways and Christopher and everybody that's, and all the Novak folks that have put this on behind the scenes. We really appreciate it. And I think it's been a great discussion. So thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Scott. And I'm going to put Dan Clean on alert here because I'm going to ask him to close for us. But wanted to let everyone know that Novak is going to be bringing more of these webinars than we have in the past. We know people are stuck at home, and hopefully we can divert your attention away from all that's going on in this world right now and get to think about some of the things we do that we enjoy, getting outdoors, in our cases, riding ATVs and dirt bikes and side-by-sides and having fun and be productive as well, not just tell stories, but maybe equip everybody with some tools so when they get back to the regular life that you'll be able to make a better effort and know a little more. And we're going to do our level best to bring in some great presenters. I know we're going to have some guests from Utah coming up. After that, we're going to have a couple really cool webinars. So please keep your eye on novac.org and your emails, and we'll be sending out information about upcoming webinars. And we really appreciate when you participate. But if for some reason you can't participate, these will be posted on Novac's website. You'll have to sign up and log in, but you will be able to access the recordings of these to view when you need to. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Clean to close. Dan is Novac's chairman of the board of directors and president, and a faithful follower of our webinar series. So Dan, you have any comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. First of all, I'd like to thank Scott for doing the presentation and Mark's input, and good to see Christopher on with us. And I believe at one point I saw 53 participants on the webinar, which is fantastic. I think in this era and time with all the challenges we're all facing, the webinars are going to be more and more popular, and the Zoom meetings and all that. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us once again, and thank the Novac staff for lining this up and getting it on again. I think we'll look forward to more webinars, and just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Stay safe out there.
Awesome, thank you. And with that, we're going to close. But thanks again to the presenter, to everybody who commented, to everybody who participated. And again, please watch your emails and watch novac.org, nohvcc.org, and we'll have more of these coming on down the pike. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.